In this video, we are going to be covering Chapter 6 on marine microbes, and there are some key concepts at first that you can come and scroll back to later, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on them now. So some of the tiniest things that are in our ocean are actually viruses, and there's a lot of viruses in our oceans. So what are viruses to begin with? Well, they're over the millennia of the time that the Earth has been around, there's been just millions and millions and millions of things that have died. And when they die, their leftover genetic junk, like their DNA and RNA, are left over. And it's thought in many cases that those tiny little bits and fragments of DNA and RNA end up making viruses. So these viruses do end up serving as a big source of food, and they also cause a lot of diseases in our oceans. They were first discovered in the 1970s, and about a liter, so if you look at this person's water bottle, is about a 1 liter bottle. A liter of seawater can have about 100 billion viral particles. And if you lined up all of the viruses in the Earth's ocean, it would stretch 10 million light years beyond Earth. So if you think of the amount of distance a ray of light could cover in a year, it can go 100 million of those is how many viruses we have in the ocean. This is an article from NOAA. Scientists just found 200,000 new marine viruses that you can check out and see what they are learning. So basically, viruses are not alive, just these little bits of DNA or RNA that are left over. So they can't reproduce, so they have to rely on other things for reproduction. And so they'll enter other cells and bodies in order to do that. Here's actually a picture of a manatee that is infected with a virus, a wart virus called a papilloma, just like humans can get, which is an STD. It can spread to different spaces. So viruses actually have these distinct shapes. So you can have this 20-sided triangular shape, which I put a little GIF here of what that looks like. That's called an icosahedral shape. You can also have a helical virus, which is like this column type of virus, or you can have a combination of the two, the icosahedral and the helical combined, to make this shape. Additionally, or this shape up here, additionally, you can have different filaments that stick off that help with binding. Usually this shape that you see here will end up infecting bacteria. So viruses actually have two different ways of infecting their host. One, and I put this GIF from the Amoeba Sisters that I really like the way they drew it out. One is called the lytic cycle and one is called the lysogenic cycle. The lytic cycle is pretty hardcore, straight to killing the organism. The virus essentially injects its DNA into the host cell, and then it makes tons of copies of itself using the cell's parts in order to make that happen, and then it explodes the cell, called lysis, and why it's called the lytic cell, and all of those new copies of the virus are released. In the lysogenic cycle, the virus will go and inject its DNA, and its DNA will actually incorporate, and you can see the yellow line and the black line, it will actually incorporate its DNA into the DNA of the host cell. And then the host cell doesn't know what's going on, so it makes lots of copies of its own DNA until eventually that host virus will decide, okay, I'm going to jump to the lytic cycle now, where I'm going to make tons of copies of myself and explode you later. So either way, it ends in the lytic cycle, but sometimes you can have the lysogenic cycle happen first. So these guys, viruses in the ocean, are 10 times more abundant than bacteria, just prokaryotes, which is crazy. The icosahedral and the binal bacteriophages, these have lytic life cycles, whereas in the sand And in the sediment, you'll tend to have the helical shapes. And I almost remember that because like you can find worms a lot of times in ocean sediment. So it's kind of that helical, like rod-like shape that is in the ocean sediment. This is a video by the Microbial Society Fishing for Phages that shows what they're doing with research in marine viruses, but there's not that much research going on. And so this is an area of marine biology that is wide open that you can do a lot of research if you are interested. This is a video by Ocean Portal, Working in the Dark, where another researcher is looking at populations of these. So what what role or ecological role do these marine viruses serve? I mean, they're there. So how are they interplaying into the whole communities around them? Well, they end up controlling a lot of the populations of other small microbes and things that are in the ocean. They do cause infection and they can cause mortality, the death of different organisms in the ocean. But there's some things that are actually controlling them. One of the things that controls them is when they attach to the wrong host. If they attach to the wrong host, usually they don't get a second chance and they end up dying. And I hate to use the word dying because they're not alive, but they're basically ineffective after that. Another way that they can be rendered ineffective is by UV light. Just ultraviolet light kills a lot of viruses. And again, I'm using that killing word cautiously because they're not alive, but the UV light can really render and just wipe out that DNA really quickly that's there. They can also be randomly absorbed by different floating things in the ocean called cestins. So they can just be absorbed by things and then they're also rendered pretty useless. This is a video by Dr. G. Branu Prakash, an animated medical videos life cycle of a bacteriophage that goes into how that happens. So now we're going to switch gears and move to marine bacteria. So the bacteria in the ocean, I found another GIF also by the Amoeba sisters that I really, really like because in a lot of ways, we think of bacteria as gross or disgusting, but bacteria actually do serve a lot of positive roles, not only here on land, but also in the ocean. So this is really a land-oriented gift, but you can apply a lot of this to the ocean as well. First, they break down a lot of food. A lot of organisms, even in the ocean, have this in their gut, and the bacteria in their guts do a lot of the food breakdown and give that food to its host organism. They also help decompose dead and decaying matter. We use them on land to make a lot of food, and they also can fix nitrogen and pull it from the air and put it in a form that we are able to use or other living things are able to use. So they can reproduce asexually by binary fission. Here is a bacillus that is rod-shaped, a bacteria that is rod-shaped, and when it is rod-shaped, it's called bacillus, or coccus, which is a round-shaped. So the nutritional types, the different ways that it eats, you can have cyanobacteria, which is photosynthetic, and it will end up storing its energy that it makes from the sun in the form of starch or oil. Well, that's really important to use sunlight to make starch and oil for other organisms to then eat in the ocean, which is cool. They also, really cool, bacteria in a lot of cases have what is called chromatic adaptation, which is a very cool adaptation where some organisms that are really close to the top of the ocean water and they are exposed to a lot of UV lights and radiation, their pigments that are not useful at that point because of the amount of lights that's there, those pigments will actually shade the other pigments so that they aren't rendered totally useless. Additionally, as you go deeper in the water column, some pigments will be more or less emphasized based on how deep the light can go, which is just really amazing that that is even possible or happens. So, there's certain photosynthetic bacteria. Some are obligate anaerobes. That means they cannot live with oxygen present, so they actually use fermentation. You also have some that are facultative anaerobes that can grow with or without oxygen, and they will switch in between. Another feeding mechanism is some bacteria are chemosynthetic bacteria. These guys are totally awesome. Down at the deepest part of the ocean, you will have some hydrothermal vents where some very, very warm, hot water is releasing some inorganic nutrients from the center of the earth, and it's heated up by magma and it's leaking through. Well, there's all these inorganic compounds that are there, including like sulfur is there, and there is bacteria that lives in the deepest part of the ocean that has developed the ability to take inorganic substances like what's coming out of the hydrothermal vents and turn them into organic substances or make them part of their own body. They have symbiotic relationships with things like tube worms down there, that where they will use the tube worm for a house, and they will feed the tube worm some of their extra food. It's just amazing to be able to live in this total darkness and still have a way to make food just from these hydrothermal vents. It's really amazing. Other bacteria are heterotrophic, where they eat other things, like some are decomposers, some have respiration or fermentation, and some have mucilage, which is like a glue-like substance that will hold them together in these dense mats and make things like these stromatolites, where they have layers upon layers of thick bacterial columns, like you see here in this shark bay in Western Australia, or here in this picture. So when bacteria decompose other organisms, they end up releasing a lot of food that were tied up in that dead and decaying matter, and release that food nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur, which become very important for other organisms. So these heterotrophic decomposition ends up aids with a few things like consolidation, making things sticky so that these nutrients and these dead things are actually stuck together. Making it consolidated like this makes it so larger things can come out and eat it. It also helps with lithification, so it changes the pH to a level that that minerals can precipitate out and form like a cement, and sedimentation, where things can settle out as particles. It also, they can help with making marine snow, which is dead and decaying organisms. Here's a picture of what it looks like, that fall from higher in the water column to deepest parts of the ocean. And then other organisms that live in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean rely on this marine snow just falling on them like manna from heaven to eat it. But I am so glad I don't have to eat this dead and decaying sticky matter that's there. Here's a video from US Ocean Gov, what is marine snow, that it shows you what it looks like as it is falling from the tops of the ocean. So nitrogen fixation is actually a process that converts atmospheric oxygen or nitrogen. So there's nitrogen up in the atmosphere, and that nitrogen will then go dissolve down into the ocean and dissolve into the ocean, but still it's not in a form that can necessarily be taken up by other organisms. So there's certain bacteria that will actually fix the nitrogen and put it into a form that can actually be used and eaten by other organisms, which is necessary for life. So this is a video by Genus Podcast, Blue-Green Algae Nitrogen Fixation of Algae, and a deeper look of how that works. Another interesting role of bacteria in the ocean fits in with the endosymbiotic theory. And this is a crazy thing that is completely considered fact by scientists. It's just so interesting, and it's like lesser known, I think, on many levels. But inside of even you, every single like cell of your body, you actually not only have your regular cell, but you actually have a bacteria living in those cells, which is your mitochondria. So the bacteria inside your cell is mitochondria. And it's thought long ago some cells actually went to go eat other cells, and those cells were able to generate energy, and pay the host cell to let them live there. So it became this mutualistic relationship where the bigger cell didn't digest it and it gave the bigger cell food for its safety. And so you might think that sounds totally crazy if you haven't heard of the endosymbiotic theory before. But interesting, when your cells divide, they actually don't divide the mitochondria. The mitochondria just ends up splitting up on different sides of the cell, and sometimes even more ends up on one side than the other. But when there's not enough mitochondria, the mitochondria actually have their own mitochondrial DNA that actually splits and makes extra mitochondria. And you get that mitochondrial DNA from your mother, and there's like so many more parts of that that I can tell you. But essentially, inside of every cell, you have a separate cell, the mitochondria, that is like a bacteria. It functions just like a bacteria. Um, Now, plants, they actually not only have the mitochondrial DNA, but they have a whole separate one that is photosynthetic called the chloroplasts. So they have chloroplasts and they have mitochondria. So this happened to plants twice. So in some ways, it's kind of almost more advanced or really cool, because the mitochondria will cover them at night when the sun isn't shining, and during the day, the chloroplasts, when there's lots of sun, that will cover them for their energy needs. So they have both. This is a video by Neural Academy, Endosymbiosis, that will show you that with some good graphics, what that looks like. Some bacteria is actually bioluminescent as well, and they have things like photophores that can emit energy using ATP. And there's a number of organisms, we will talk about them in future chapters, that actually harbor this photosynthetic bacteria and use it when they need to. And there's even some evidence that some organisms, like certain fish, control when the bacteria is lighting up by depriving it of like oxygen or nutrients that the bacteria need. And then when they want it to light up, they'll flush it with nutrients and oxygen to make the light go off. It's really crazy, and that's for future chapters. So there's another domain that we need to talk about called the archaea. And the archaea are very, very, very tiny, and they can live in very extreme conditions. Their cells lack special sugar amino acid compounds, and their cell membranes contain different unique lipids. This is a video by Ocean Portal, the microbial loop, that is pretty interesting and shows you a little more about that. So some of them are photosynthetic, some are chemosynthetic, and some are heterotroph. So they eat lots of different ways. They do produce methane as a byproduct. Some are halobacteria, where they require a lot of salt in order to survive. That's helpful for the ocean. And there's others that need extreme heat in order to live. Okay, switching gears again and going to the eukaryotes, there's several different types. As you know, these are the ones that have what is called a true cell, and you can kind of think these are things that you can really relate to, like plants, animals, fungus, algae, and protists. So we're going to go over the fungi first. There's not a ton of fungi in the ocean, as far as everyone knows. So the first marine fungi were discovered in the mid 1800s. And their ecological role is really hard to know how much of these came from land and how much are truly ocean fungus that are really like only able to survive in the ocean. This is a video by TMVDE Marine Fungi that you can check out for a little bit more on that. So the fungi have these walls of chitin, and they have these hyphae that can branch and produce mycelium, which are these hairy black tufts. Like think of like when you think of black bread mold, this is what we're talking about. And there's certain ones that can only digest lignin, which is wood cellulose. And obviously there's not a ton of wood in the ocean. It's not necessarily growing in the ocean. So basically this is where it's found is chunks of wood that end up in the ocean. They will sometimes have fungus on it. Well, that's thought to originate from land, but it's somehow out there surviving. Fungi will store their energy like a starch or a carb called glycogen. And there's a couple different types here that are listed, and I put examples here. The Ascomycota is the most diverse. This is like 81%. And this is sort of like a yeast, but out in the ocean. So some fungi are obligate marine, meaning they have to live in the ocean, and some are facultatively marine, meaning they normally live on land, but somehow they ended up out in the water. Most of the time, this high salt is toxic to fungi. Like I said, sometimes they live on wood, other lives on grass or algae or mangroves or sand. So some fungi actually can decompose the chitin from dead crustaceans that have died. This is a cool article I put here, Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, and I put the link there. This is just a cool article showing how they're looking at using marine fungus to make have different develop new chemotherapy methods. So some way that it's very important to us. So marine fungi can reproduce asexually by budding, and they can basically make these filamentous type of arms and extension that come off of them, but on the tips they will make a spore that can break away and be carried away by different currents. And they can also reproduce sexually by forming that ascocarp or that longer arm extension that we saw earlier. So shifting away from fungus and moving to maritime lichens. So lichens are definitely special to me. I've always liked them because it is actually not its own thing. They put it with the fungus because it's actually a combination. When you see a lichen on land, it's actually a combination of a fungus and an algae together. The fungus makes this like clear, tubey, extension shape on the outside, and then an algae's like, oh, there's a cool tubey house that I can move into, and it goes and moves into it. So it's actually, when you see a lichen, you're talking about two totally different things living together, from two totally different types of things, a fungus and an algae living together. This is a video by Tasmanian Viking marine lichen, east coast of Tasmania, where you can see some of the lichens on the rock. So the next one is called the Stramenopiles, and they are actually organisms that have two flagella, one for moving and one with feathery extensions for gathering food. This is a video by Protus Lab Film, Paraphysomas, and Stokes 1885, where you can see what those look like. Okay, on to one of my favorites because I just think they are so cool, diatoms. Diatoms are extremely diverse and very abundant. They have an amazing structure. This reminds me of like an organism living inside of a glass petri dish where they have living material on the inside, but on the outside, it's actually totally glass, and it's these two different halves that fit over each other that you could open like a petri dish. It's so cool. And the outside is inorganic as a shell. So it's the only living thing that I know of that has this inorganic material shell that is made of silica, which is like glass. These can be radial symmetrical or bilaterally symmetrical, but they're very, very beautiful to look at and very geometric. So they can reproduce a few ways. I do not necessarily like this picture. It kind of does the job, but you have to think creatively when you see it. So one of the ways that diatoms can divide is asexually, where they just split in half. But think about the fact that I just said that these diatoms, their outsides are made of glass. So if you're splitting in half, basically it's very hard to divide glass in half. So the organism basically just got smaller because now it's just half of its size, which is not really shown in this picture. But then it can divide and divide and divide again. Eventually now, this diatom is so tiny and it's got this glass structure and it can't expand that basically the diatom makes the decision of like, hey, we can't do this asexual thing anymore, so we're going to actually open up our petri dish and open the frustule and release our gametes, our sex cells. So it releases its gametes from the inside, and those bind together and find another free gamete from another frustule, and that forms a zygote, a little baby diatom. And that baby diatom grows the inside of it, the organic matter, really big, and then it starts to grow a glass outside, and then you have a brand new diatom that it has formed. So that's kind of crazy, right? Diatoms are full of oils. That's how they make their food, and they accumulate their food as oils in their bodies. So when you see this video by Journey to the Microcosmos, Diatoms, Tiny Factories You Can See from Space, you look at this one and it's full of these little bubbles of oil. And when they eventually die, they fall to the bottom of the ocean. Remember, oil and water don't really mix, and there's so many of these in the ocean, you can literally see them from space. And so these fall to the bottom of the ocean. And a lot of them fall to the bottom of the ocean and they get packed down by all of the water and other sediment down there. And eventually those oils accumulate. And it's thought that the majority of the world's petroleum reserves are actually from these dead diatoms that have accumulated their oils down there. So you can thank them for all of the oil that exists that we use in huge amounts today. But also accumulating is not just the oil from their body, but also, they're surrounded by a glass. And you can actually touch this glass and it feels like powder. It's called diatomaceous earth. It's highly absorbent. It's used in paints and in other places. But actually, it can also be used in pest control. Because it is like glass shards when these have died, if you sprinkle it around, say, like an anthill, when you see the ants go walk through it, they will actually, you'll see them pass through, you'll see the white powder, diatomaceous earth get on them, and it'll work through their body like glass shards. And you see them kind of writhing in pain until they die, which is kind of sad. But a lot of people put a border of this around the outside of their house as a form of pest control because it can easily work into the bodies of insects and kill them. And here's a picture of what the diversity of diatoms looks like. And I just think they look like tiny works of art. They are so cool. Okay. Another type is called the Ochrophytes and the Silicoflagellates. And these guys are very common in very cold marine waters. They have this cool skeleton on the outside, which can be exposed, or you can have cellular like tissue go around it. There's also the pelagocyte phycenes that can form these mats in the ocean, and they are also ochrophytes, and by forming these mats, it can actually block out the sun and stop certain organisms from photosynthesizing, or it like can get sucked up like a goo in filtration systems and cause problems. Here's a video by Alison Gong, the silicoflagellates, and then another video by BP International, monitoring and identifying of planktonic genera, species, and determination of the physiochemicals. So it looks at those a little bit closer and you can see what those look like. So Labyrinthomorpha and the labyrinthulids are another organism that are kind of parasitic, and they will actually prey on organisms like seagrass that get really sick and it's weak. And then when that happens and the organism doesn't have the best immune system, they will go and parasitize on them, and they parasitize things like kelp or seagrass or invertebrates. Um, there's other ones of them that are used for dietary supplements and are used for their oil as part of a fish food. Um, the phylum Haptophytes are really also another gorgeous organism that lives in the water. They actually have a series of about 30 coccoliths on the outside, and each of these will break off over time and replicate and make new haptophytes. These are actually super reflective, and when they're photographed in large numbers from space, they'll actually reflect light back that you can see it from that far of a distance. It's really cool. I also want to mention here that these guys, at least 40% of the carbonate in the ocean are from these coccoliths, which is so cool. Okay, so the alveolates. These examples of these are the dinoflagellates, and these can get their food by photosynthesis or osmotrophy, which is just absorbing nutrients from the surrounding environment, or like in this little gif here, they can get nutrition by phagocytosis, where they basically just go up to something, give it a big hug, and it gets absorbed into their body. These are critically important for our oceans, especially the dinoflagellates, because this is the zooplankton that forms symbiotic relationships with our coral that ends up giving our coral a lot of their foods. So they all have different plates, and that's how they are basically classified. This is a video by Roxy Davies, Dinoflagellates, the life that glows, because additionally, there's a lot of them that can generate light, just like the bacteria that we were talking about earlier. So when they reproduce, they can do that asexually or sexually, and they actually have some dormant stages where they go into cis. And so I'd mentioned really quickly there that these are the organisms that make symbiotic relationships with the coral, and without these inside the coral will actually starve to death. These are also the organisms that give coral their color. So coral is actually its body is actually normally clear, and then it takes on these zooxanthellae, which is a type of dinoflagellate. It takes on these zooxanthellae, and whatever color these dinoflagellates are, that becomes the color of the coral. These zooxanthellae will give the coral food and nutrition, and the coral gives these zooxanthellae safety and a place to live. But these, because if you can see by the name, they're photosynthetic, so that's kind of like a plant, but it says zooxanthellae because they are kind of like an animal. They're both. They're kind of like a plant and an animal. They're just amazing like that. Well, these guys, when the sun is really bright, they'll tend to over photosynthesize, which causes their animal part of their body to create nasty waste that is too high for the coral. And the coral is like, ew, gross, I don't have a good filtration system to handle this. So it ends up expelling the zooxanthellae. And when it does that, the coral is not only covered in this waste, but now it has no way to feed itself. And so the coral has also lost its color, because it was the dinoflagellate zooxanthellae that was giving it its color. So now the coral is said to be bleached because it's lost its color and it has no way to feed itself. It isn't quite dead yet, but it will die in a matter of days to a few weeks, max maybe about a month, if it doesn't find a healthy, and conditions don't change where it can take on a healthy zooxanthellae again. So these are very, very important. These are also parasites of copepods, and they will eat other zooxanthellae. So dinoflagellates, if that didn't make them awesome enough for giving us coral, they can also make harmful algal blooms. where you get these things called like red tides and they choke out other things. The way that that happens, here's a video by SciShow on bioluminescence, is basically in places like Southern California, we'll have times of extreme extended drought. And when that happens, a lot of people use fertilizers and there's a bunch of nutrient buildup on land. Well, eventually, when a rain finally does come, if it's a big rain, it'll pour all those nutrients off of land that have really accumulated because the drought was long over many, many months. And that will all feed out into our oceans. Well, these bacteria live, or these dinoflagellates live there year round in our waters. But in small numbers. But when all these nutrients come out into the water all at once, it causes a bloom of these where a lot of these will duplicate and replicate very, very rapidly. Well, it's kind of cool because it makes our waves glow, and that's awesome. But then when those nutrients are gone, everything kind of chokes out. The oxygen gets heavily reduced and everything dies at once. So it's kind of one of those beautiful but tragic types of events. But if you want to see these in our oceans anytime in Southern California, or I've seen them down in Mexico, but they're not everywhere in the world. Like, we're pretty unique and there's in a few different places. You can swim out in the ocean when it's very, very dark and hopefully there's no moon out, and swim out in the ocean at night in the darkest parts and there's no street lights around. And if you wave your feet and your hands under the water, your hands everywhere they touch will just light up like thousands of stars. And everywhere your foot kicks, there's just thousands of stars, and it's beautiful. And I just love seeing them. So alveolates are also another type is called the ciliates. They are literally covered with cilia, and the cilia not only help them to eat but help them to move. They have this cytosome, this groove that brings in food to feed them. They are highly, highly understudied. So this is something that if you are interested, you could take off and have a whole career made out of this. This is a video by Journey to the Microcosmos. These walking ciliates are frustrating because they don't totally get how they're working or even how to classify them. So they can form symbiotic and parasitic relationships. Here's just another picture of them, and it shows all the cilia and what it looks like up close. So with these ciliates, most are heterotrophs where they're eating other things and they use that cilia to bring it in, although some of them are symbiotes, or they have chloroplasts that they have brought inside of them to make them food. So the choanoflagellates are very, very, very closely related to animals based on their genome. They have a lot of markers that show that they may be a distant ancestor to when true animals went and took off and started growing on Earth. They are highly efficient consumers of bacteria. A very closely related version of these live inside of sea sponges, and they use their flagella to push themselves through the water. This is a video by Journey to the Microcosmos, getting to know our single-celled ancestors for more information on them. So amoeboid protozoans are also heterotroph. They have this really cool structure on the outside called a test. And this test is basically a membrane that can be covered with different foreign particles that aren't made out of them. It just collects stuff from the ocean, little bits of stuff. But a lot of times it's actually just strengthened by different minerals that surround it. So this is a video by Journey to the Microcosmos, Foramifera, hard on the outside and squishy on the inside, that tells you more about Foraminiferans. They are really, really cool. So the main types are the Foraminiferans or the actinopods. Actinopods have these arms that radiate outward from their body that help them to capture food, but also it helps them kind of float and not sink very deeply in the water since they don't have a good other way to control their movement. Interesting, these radiolarans from these little holes that you see in their body, they actually will project out these insanely long projections outside of them to capture food. So they send out this huge web outside of their body to do this. This is a video by Deep Marine Scenes Facts, Foramifera, the invisible protists that are everywhere. And I think in this video, it shows those webs coming out and how they feed. So they actually consume bacteria and they consume other diatoms. Some of them will actually harbor green and red algae and zooxanthellae, again, making symbiotic, like mutualistic relationships where they will provide the house and the other algae and zooxanthellae will provide the food. So these formiferan tests can look like this. Isn't that just so pretty how tiny and delicate? And also, by the way, this is blown up really big because these are actually microscopic. So all this beauty is too small to even see, but they are their own individual pieces of sand. So imagine walking on a beach and you think this sand is just some weird cube. But if you could look at it under the microscope and it's formiferans, this is how gorgeous their different bodies are. It's so pretty. Some of them are very pink and can make some beautiful pink sand beaches. And some of these were actually orange and formed the orangey color that you see on the ancient pyramids of Egypt are actually formiferans that were orange. Inside of these tests, which remember that's the name of the outside of their body, they actually will build these little chambers inside and they'll fill them with air so that they can float and not just fall down in the ocean column. They can be multi-colonies and make an ooze, or they can be out there by themselves. They'll have zooxanthellae that can live symbiotically with them, or they can have photosynthetic zooxanthellae inside of them, where the zooxanthellae will photosynthesize and make food, and the foramen will actually feed it its waste. And so they basically just are constantly feeding each other. So the next time you take a gigantic mouthful of ocean water when you're surfing or swimming in the ocean, you can think about all the millions of these different creatures that are in just one mouthful of water, because in a liter of the ocean water, you know, is like millions upon millions of just ocean viruses. So I hope I didn't scare you off from the ocean, but I do hope you join me for the next video where we're going to be talking about all the things that photosynthesize in the ocean.